Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food Ingredients Europe. My name is Claudia Mucciardi. I am an ESSNA Vice Chair, and I also head up regulatory and quality compliance for Nutrabolt in Europe. Today, I'll be speaking about the European Commission's legislative proposal on front-of-pack nutrition labeling and nutrient profiles, looking at the challenges and opportunities. So just in a look at today's agenda, I'll give a brief introduction to ESSNA. We'll look at the evolution of the regulatory framework for sports and active nutrition. We'll then move on to the EU's farm to fork strategy and looking at its impact. And then more specifically, the mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling and nutrient profiles, their challenges and opportunities. And we'll close up with some final remarks, as well as looking at ESSNA's role in supporting the industry during these times. So who is ESSNA? ESSNA is the European Specialist Sports Nutrition Alliance, and it is a European-wide trade association which essentially acts as the voice for the sports nutrition sector in Europe. And ESSNA really works to ensure a fair and balanced legislative framework for the sports nutrition sector, as well as to better educate the public on responsible and safe approaches to sports nutrition. Here you'll see some of ESSNA's aims and objectives. So we have shaping legislation and removing regulatory barriers, strengthening the reputation of the sector, addressing non-compliance and inadvertent doping, and then raising members' profiles, as well as providing a forum for discussion and networking for its members. So let's look at how sports nutrition has evolved in terms of its regulatory framework. So previously, sports nutrition used to be regulated under PARNUTS, which is food for particular nutritional uses. And even though there was meant to be a very specific kind of regulation for sports foods, this never actually fully developed. It was under PARNUTS, probably not really fit for purpose because the other food categories that were under PARNUTS were really for more vulnerable consumers. And so in a way, athletes were treated as vulnerable consumers. It was really quite a niche market at the time. So in 2009, PARNUTS was being reviewed. And in 2013, the Foods for Specific Groups regulation was basically, it repealed PARNUTS. And only 3 different food categories from PARNUTS actually got moved over to Foods for Specific Groups, and sports foods was not one of them. So that was good news that sports foods was not included in the FSG regulation. In 2016, the Commission put out a report on foods intended for sports people, and this further confirmed that sports foods were to be considered or were to be kind of under general food law, which was basically ESSNA's much preferred option. It also mentioned in the report that although no specific legislation was needed, that the specificities of the sector should really be taken into account when implementing any horizontal legislation going forward. So that's a key point to be aware of. So from July 2016, sports foods have fallen under general food law. There may be some specific legislation such as the Food Supplements Directive that could apply, but this still falls under the general food law umbrella. What we're seeing today with the farm to fork strategy and the potential revisions of the food information to consumer regulation is that the EU Commission is looking to propose mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling as well as nutrient profiles. So let's look at the farm to fork strategy. So this was published in May 2020. And it's part of the European Green Deal, and its aim is really to promote healthier and more sustainable food systems. So there are a number of proposals as part of the farm to fork strategy that would affect sports nutrition. However, let's focus on the 2 of most interest right now, and those are setting of nutrient profiles to restrict the promotion of foods that are high in fat, sugars, and salt, as well as the introduction of harmonized mandatory front-of-pack nutrition labeling. So both these proposals were due out in Q4 2022, so end of this year, although the front-of-pack nutrition labeling, it's likely that it will be postponed until Q1 of 2023. So if we look at how this is kind of the state of play in the legislative process of how this has worked. So in September 2021, the European Parliament basically adopted its own initiative report on the farm to fork strategy. and this was with ESSNA's engagement. The report stated that the front of pack nutrition labeling must be developed based on independent scientific evidence and demonstrated consumer understanding, taking into account specialist foods as well as the additional burden for food operators. In March of 2022, to help inform the revision of the Food Information to Consumers regulation, there was a public consultation as well as a stakeholder study, both of which ESSNA participated in. In April 2022, EFSA basically published its scientific advice on nutrient profiling for the development of harmonized front of pack nutrition labeling. And here actually EFSA recommended that dietary fibers as well as potassium be included in the model, as well as energy, saturated fats, free sugars or added sugars, and sodium. And then in September 2022, the Commission's Research Hub, which is the Joint Research Center, they published their updated literature review on front of pack nutrition labeling. So we can see all of these basically are feeding in to the EU Commission's legislative proposals, which are due out end of this year or beginning of next year. It's also worth noting that ESSNA has recently learned that the Nutri-Score is highly unlikely to be the model, let's say, of front of pack nutrition labeling that's used European-wide, even though at one point this was considered the most favorites and had really strong backing from from many European countries, actually, including France and Germany. So if we look at the farm to fork strategy, so what do we see as being the impact? So we believe that the setting of front of pack nutrition labeling and nutrient profiles would negatively unfairly penalize the sports nutrition sector. And this is really because the models used to develop these really relate to the general population and don't really take into account the specific dietary needs of sports people, for example, right? Also, if you think about, many sports products are actually formulated with higher levels of what's considered negative nutrients, so sugars and salts, formulated with these to meet a specific benefit, a specific dietary need or performance benefits. But consequently, that would mean the products would then have a poor rating on front of pack, and consumers can then, can view these products as being unhealthy, even though they do have a specific benefit. And then on the side of nutrient profiling, it'd be the same thing. If these products are subject to nutrient profiling, it basically means they won't be able to make any claims, and then consumers would be deprived of quite valuable information. So in order for ESSNA to basically further understand the impact that the farm to fork strategy, these legislative proposals, would have on the sector, ESSNA put out a questionnaire over the summer to the industry, to the sports nutrition industry, trying to gauge kind of economic impact, and kind of the general feel for front of pack nutrition labeling. So the key findings are, one, only a very small proportion of the industry currently employs front of pack nutrition labeling. The industry widely opposes mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling. Some of the key concerns are related to consumer confusion, and then obviously the resource and economic impact of relabeling, potentially reformulation. And looking at the anticipated costs, they could potentially range from 100,000 euros up to about 4 million euros, depending on the size of the business. So let's look at some of the specific responses that were received from the questionnaire. So these have been divided into several kind of different groups. So if we look at relabeling first, that's clearly the most kind of worrying, just because of the sheer volume of labels that would have to be redone. So there's obviously an economic, a cost associated with that could be related to, the actual labels themselves, the printer plates. Depending on timeline, would new hires need to be, employed in order to kind of work on this project? Would there be specific regulatory approval needed? Then changes to marketing material as well. Are there going to be any space constraints, considering this is mandatory on front of pack? Will the claims or any marketing text have to be, or design have to be compromised? And then also, depending on timelines, If there's any unused labels that have not been updated in stock, those have to be written off. Moving over to reformulation, key point here is that in many cases, there's very little room for reformulation. Products are formulated with certain levels of nutrients to provide a certain benefit for the sports person, and therefore there's kind of limited scope in terms of products that can actually be improved. For those that can be improved, again, there's an economic cost, there's the R&D that's needed for the reformulations, and then subsequently tasting panels, sensory studies, will there be changes in the taste, changes in the mouthfeel, changes in the consumer experience? From a demand perspective, there's a question of whether consumers will be confused by these labels. Will there be a misunderstanding, or will consumers feel misled by the functionality of certain ingredients or products? Also, for sports people, if they actually are swayed to getting a product that has a better score, let's just say, they could be actually losing out on some valuable nutrients. And so overall, we're seeing potentially a loss of reputation of the sector, and we're seeing possibly a decrease in demand and a decrease in sales. We have another category at the end, and basically the main thought here, the main worry here, was the fact that there could be a divergence between the EU and the UK. So farm to fork strategy really is for the EU. The UK is not involved in this. However, considering how the UK is the main or the biggest sports nutrition market in Europe, many brands will be selling the same products to the UK as the rest of the EU. And if there is this divergence in terms of labeling schemes, it just means brands will have to now have separate SKUs for the UK, which then just adds complexity to the business. So these responses were from, contributors like within the sports nutrition industry, and they reflect issues in the sports nutrition industry, but it's worth noting that many of these actually would apply to the wider food industry as well. All right, do we see there are any opportunities? So the responses received, there were a few that kind of pointed out there could be some advantages. So the three main ones that we saw were improved competitiveness, an increase in demand for better scoring products, and more R&D. So let's look at the first two because they kind of go hand in hand, the improved competitiveness and an increase in demand for better scored products. So would there be improved competitiveness? Potentially, but again, I think the scope is very, very limited because there could maybe be, a couple of products that would potentially score better than competitor products within the same category, right? Could consumers potentially, or could there be potentially an increase in demand for better scored products? Yes, for these very few couple of products that potentially could have various scores within the same category. But the question then goes back to functionality. Would these better scoring products be better for the sports people, for the consumers, if they're actually lacking functionality, right? So if we take the example of a carbohydrate electrolyte solution, so this is basically formulated, with high levels of sugars, high levels of salt. These are the conditions that they need to meet in order to bear the claims related to, hydration and endurance performance. So this type of product would score poorly. If a competitor were to go out and decide they're going to put a fraction of the salts, a fraction of the sugars in the product, yes, it would get a better score, but the consumer would actually be missing, the sports person would actually be missing, the key nutrients, the key ingredients they need to get that benefit from the product, right? Third point being more R&D. We could expect that, yes, this would obviously trigger more R&D investment. And I think that's very clearly the case in the wider food industry. We see a lot of beverage companies doing this, snack food companies trying to improve the scores of their current range of products. However, as mentioned previously, sports foods are developed and are formulated for a specific purpose, for specific benefits, and there's very little room for R&D actually, or for reformulation without losing functionality. So it could be that this doesn't really apply much to sports nutrition. It's worth noting that ESSNA remains in favor of exemptions for both front-of-pack nutrition labeling and nutrient profiles. Even though mentioned earlier that Nutri-Score is unlikely to be chosen as the model, ESSNA still opposes that scheme, the Nutri-Score, which is actually in line with Public Santé, which is France's public health authority, because they actually put out a Q&A on Nutri-Score that stated that sports nutrition products are not eligible for the application of Nutri-Score. The underlying nutrient profile system of Nutri-Score was developed in regard to the needs of the general population, whereas sports nutrition must meet particular needs. So we're seeing this theme kind of reoccurring time and time again, whether it's regarding, specifically front of pack nutrition labeling models, or the fact of, horizontal legislation across the board. We're seeing that the specificities of specialist nutrition or specifically sports nutrition are there's the idea that there should be some exemptions there. However, we don't know. We're hoping that this is basically going to be reflected in the proposals that are due out, end of this year, beginning of next year. So just to conclude, some final remarks. So as mentioned earlier, sports foods have been governed under general food law since July 2016, and it's basically been quite a stable regulatory environment since then. However, now we're seeing this new wave of regulatory obligations. Unfortunately, the challenges are outweighing the opportunities in these cases. Really, to avert kind of the negative impact of these labeling requirements and to hopefully get the appropriate exemptions, really the industry must really come together. And the impact that we are seeing on both front of pack nutrition labeling and nutrient profiles will actually go beyond sports and active nutrition industry. So what is ESSNA doing during these challenging times to help? So through political influence, they are constantly engaging with MEPs and the commission, through engagement with stakeholders, and this is not only within the sports nutrition industry, but also the wider food industry, in order to join forces and build alliances, through intelligence and analysis, through everything farm to fork related and beyond, through tailored regulatory advice to its members, and providing a forum for discussion with the very kind of topical working groups such as food labeling. So just to note that in the next few months, ESSNA will be intensifying its engagement, and that is basically to ensure that this forthcoming legislation does not negatively impact the sports and active nutrition sectors. Thank you very much.